My name's John Downey. I'm Professor of Comparative Media Analysis at Loughborough University. And as part of our activities at the Institute of Advanced Study, we are holding a series of conversations, and our latest guest is Gianpietro Mazzoleni, who's Professor of Political Communication at the University of Milan. Gianpietro, you've recently retired from the University of Milan, a long and illustrious career. I'd like to spend a few minutes of the interview just talking about your intellectual biography. So, for example, I was very interested to see that your first degree as an undergraduate was actually at an American college. Could you talk a little bit about why you went to study in the States and what you found out there and your experiences?
Yeah, that was long ago, by the way, the late 60s. In those 60s in America, there were a lot of things going on. The war in Vietnam was still going on, and the students were rioting in the universities. So the atmosphere, the political atmosphere, was quite nervous, so to speak. And when I went to study sociology, which was a kind of a weird subject for Italy and for Italian students. So winning a purse from the Employers Association, I could attend an American college and study sociology with the idea to return and work in their industrial relations departments. What happened is that I didn't have any idea of I didn't have any idea of what was sociology about, and so I had to learn from scratch, and I fell in love with sociology, so to speak. And then I also performed fairly well. I was on the Dean's list, something unusual for the Italian, for a foreign student going to America. So that encouraged me to engage more in studying society. Of course, in that case, I was right in the middle of American society with all the problems that I mentioned. So I tuned in with the climate of opinion of the times. And that opened up also my attention for politics and for the media. And so from that moment on, I abandoned the idea to return to a job in the industry. And from that moment on, after my graduation, I pursued a university career, a research career.
Mm-hmm. And I understand that you started writing about political communication while you were an undergraduate.
Yes,
in the States.
Yeah, that's something I just found in my boxes that I still have at my home. A paper, a position paper that I had to write for English composition class. And I remember to have written a paper with the title, A New Wave of Conservatism in American Politics. And that explained in a way, to some extent at least, why Nixon had won in 1968. By the way, I had a chance to listen to Nixon in college when he came to, during the campaign. I was in New Hampshire, and I could listen to his rhetoric, and I got to know him, not personally, of course, but from the accounts of the media. And I remember how he was nicknamed the Tricky Dick, which was kind of funny for me. But then there was the idea that America was going towards a chaos, towards illegal mass behavior because of the riots, because of Students for Democratic Society, because of the Vietnam War, the fuck the draft movement of people, of future soldiers moving to Canada to escape the draft. So he presented himself in a populist way, we might say. You know, in those days, nobody spoke about populism. In a populist way, saying that we need to go back to law and order. And that was the slogan of his campaign in 1968. And by the way, he won with a landslide in 1968.
Mm-hmm. So, looking back over your career, I guess one of the concepts that you're known for writing about is the concept of mediatization, and this is possibly the biggest concept, biggest buzzword in contemporary communication studies, and it's probably fair to say that you were one of the first people to use the concept. And I think if you look at your early work from or at least your early work in English, published in English from the early 80s, you already see there the development, I think, of the concept of mediatization around the notion of media logic. Could you just talk a little bit about media logic and how you started thinking about that?
Yeah, that came long after my American experience. You know, my American experience was, you know, it was education to sociology, and when I returned back to Italy, I got my doctorate from the University of Rome in sociology of communication, and my thesis was about the effects of the media on voting behavior. It was rather an analysis of the literature because I couldn't afford to make any personal research, empirical research, and in those days nobody was interested very much in that because of the Italian situation, the political situation is, you know, I'm speaking about the early 70s, it was completely different from the Berlusconi years, for instance, that would come 10 years later. Anyway, together with Paolo Mancini, who is also very well known in the literature, in the academic literature about the media and politics, and Giorgio Grossi from the University of Torino, we put together our forces to study, you know, how the media intervened into the election campaigns in Italy, because we noticed that something was changing compared to what had been for so long in Italy, you know, boring campaigns or highly ideological campaigns, politics over anything else. Now the media were, in a way, saying their own word, not necessarily through journalism, but like in this case, in our case at least, was the turn towards a commercialization of the television system, which was, by the way, unregulated. So everybody could put up a commercial television, local television, and the politicians started to use local televisions to make, you know, commercials, you know, for their campaign. So that was absolutely something new that we thought deserved to be investigated. So we did a good study with the campaign of 1983 that we thought it was the first mediatized campaign in a way. We did use that word, and we relied on, you know, to elaborate on the concept of mediatization. On the we drew on the work by Altid and Snow, Media Logic. We found their work very insightful. So we tried to apply, you know, what was meant by media logic to what was changing in the media system in Italy vis-a-vis politics. And so that's the moment when we started to use mediatization. And then I published later with Winfried Schulz, but it was already a reflection on not only on the Italian situation, but also, comparatively speaking, looking around at least Europe, but not only Europe. You know, mediatization, even though the Americans don't love the word, it was already something established in American politics. Look at the way the politicians are dealt with, covered by the media, how they have to come to deals with the media logic. And so it's the American political campaign, election campaign, is highly mediatized. Nobody says or uses this expression, but we thought that it was a good way of explaining, the differences for the American system, the American mediatization, and see how it applied to what was going on, not only in Italy, because also around Europe there was more regulated maybe, but there was a tendency to rely more and more on the media for political campaigns. As I said, in the old days, in what Blumler and Kavanagh called the first age of political communication, when television was not around, the election battle was based on ideas, ideologies, and on social cleavages and political cleavages. In the second age, when television comes, and especially when commercial television comes, independent television comes, well, the political logics of the past started to be shaken up, and so other logics were entering into the landscape. Well, now, if you think that the politicians have to adapt themselves, that's already a kind of a revolution, because they used to manage and govern the communication themselves before. Now they have to come to terms with the media, and the media have different logics than politicians.
So you said that you sort of adapted the concept of media logic from a North American context and applied it to the Italian context, because you saw something new that was happening in Italy in the 1980s, and it was and one of the factors was the commercialization of television and the very unregulated way that it happened in the Italian case. Does that mean that mediatization, just in terms of the history of mediatization, does that mean that it happens at different times in different places? Does that mean that the United States led the way, and it was I don't know, guess followed by the UK, because in the UK we had commercial TV in the 1950s? Is it how do we think about the history of mediatization?
Well, it was sort of a sequential order. I mean, not necessarily the American mediatization impacted directly or was intentionally diffused to update or to renovate or to modernize election campaigns around, at least not in the continental Europe or in the established democracies. That happened later, when the Berlin Wall fell, and so the new democracies were coming up. So the Americans, in that case, they sent their own teams to teach how to run a campaign using the media, having media experts, consultants, and so on. In Europe, it became in Western Europe, let's say, to be short. In France, in Germany, in Italy, and in Britain, with differences, of course. It was everywhere the same phenomenon, but there were many similarities. What happened in these countries is that since the media became more and more powerful and more independent from politicians, like in Italy, for instance, before the arrival of commercial television was a monopoly by the state, so it was heavily controlled by the state. It's still, kind of controlled by the state, public service broadcasting. So commercial television was something so independent and uncontrollable in a way that politicians were very worried about. So the Berlusconi phenomenon comes up exactly in a context like this, where commercial television became powerful, it became itself a player, a political player, and its owner, not by chance, stepped into the political fray and became himself a politician, using his own 3 big national networks. Of course, that didn't happen in Germany, that didn't happen in France, and that didn't happen in UK. But apart from the specificities of the Italian case, we can say that in the other democracies there was a keener attention by politicians, candidates, officials for the contribution that the media could bring to their communication. The political marketing is something that rises exactly in those years. Again, it depends from country to country, because it depends very much on the electoral system. If the electoral system allows free campaigning or free uses of the media, like in Italy, so the commercials, for instance, the political commercials, the election commercials, were a strong instrument for electoral communication. So all these changes, we observed these changes in Italy first, and then later in other countries comparatively, and we looked for the impact, how this changes in the media system and in the attitude of political actors towards the media had any implication in terms of political communication. And the idea of mediatization has to do with an attempt to explain what was changing in the political systems.
So mediatization basically means that, or mediatization of politics basically means that politicians adapt their behavior to fit in with the rules and conventions of media institutions rather than trying to impose their control over media institutions. Does that, do we see that there are differences in different places depending on, say, the strength of public service television in different countries? Are there some countries where politicians still have more control over media institutions than
there
others?
are slight differences, I might say, because if you consider journalism, the differences can be substantial from one country to the other. But if you consider the media, or the new media, and in terms of new television, the color television, interactive television, satellite television, that was between the mid-80s until the mid-90s, before the rise of the internet. In that period, you see many similarities, like the personalization of politics. As I said, in the old days, politicians or political leaders didn't really care much about their own personal image. Nobody knew much about their personal life, or to use a term very popular, made very popular by our colleague James Stanier, their intimate life. Nobody knew anything about them. Now, with the spotlights of the media, 24 hours a day, on you, politician or would-be political leaders, politicians started to care more about their own personal image, and so they had to rely on personal, personal coaches. I mean, coaches that they help you how to speak in public, public speaking, how to take care of your hair, of your appearances in public. This is one case.
So do you think that the media logic, commercialization of television, do you think that drives political personalization as well?
and also, you know, the BBC itself, you know, in a way drove towards this sort of personalization without being dedicated to personalized politics. But the fact that you had to go into a show and you had to, you know, go the right way, and so this is one example. The other example is the mediagenic personality. So if you are good looking, if you're a good looking lady, if you are very good in cracking jokes, so you are a pleasurable person, you might have more chances to become a successful leader. Maybe eventually you will be no good in the substance, but as far as the image is concerned, you will be a successful leader. And that happened maybe not in big cases here and there, even in Germany. You know, some popular personages could build some ambition to become politicians, and they relied on their popularity. Okay, so there are many cases, we could stay here for hours to list all of them, how the media change the way politicians interact with their supporters and constituencies.
You mentioned Berlusconi earlier on, and obviously Berlusconi was an extremely wealthy entrepreneur, extremely wealthy businessman, and in the aftermath of the crisis of the political system in Italy in the early 90s, Berlusconi became president of the Council of Ministers, and he obviously owned newspapers and television stations, and so there seems to be this sort of confluence of this commercial TV, populist media, with a populist politician. But would you see Berlusconi as a populist politician, or is that not really a concept that's?
Well, probably it's not the best example of the populism that we know nowadays, but certainly he played the populist card many times in his way of, you know, appearing in public, in things that he used to say about, you know, certain domestic issues, you know, poverty or not poverty, taxes and not taxes. So some of the rhetoric of Berlusconi, as I said, not always, but some of the rhetoric can be defined as populist. But probably he's not technically, we might say, even though populism is a very loose concept. With, you know, political scientists are still quarreling about how to define precisely populism. So yeah, we can say that Berlusconi was the early populist of Italian modern democracy. But you can see and find populism in many other leaders that are not necessarily considered populists. Even in the left-hand side of the political spectrum, many political leaders, you know, strike popular cards in saying that, you know, the poor should pay less taxes. It can be considered populist because you address the popular sentiments there, and you talk directly to them. And of course, the intention is to attract their support in order to win the election. So Berlusconi, going back to Berlusconi, yeah, he was populist, and but there are other populists who were 24 hours a day populist. Berlusconi probably was populist a few hours a day. Let's put it that way.
We're living through a sort of a populist moment in world politics, arguably with Trump and Brexit. Modi in India, arguably, is a populist, and there are a number of European populist parties and movements, left, right, centre, and there are lots of people who are starting to write about populism. And I guess, looking back, you've been writing about populism for 20 years, so you're sort of 20 years ahead of the game, as it were. And one of the questions that always interested me is, why did you actually start writing about media populism? What was the motivation behind that?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, because the book, The Media and Neo-Populism, was published in 2003, but the research, which is a comparative research, has been done in the turn of the century, of the millennium, between 1999 to 2002. It was almost, sometimes you do research unplanned. You see, wow, this is a nice case to study. Why don't we invest some money and some time and some energy to investigate about it? So in my case, I had the chance to be invited to the University of Southern Queensland, close to Brisbane, in 1998, and in that area it was very popular and very famous. One lady, Pauline Hanson, that I didn't know anything about her, coming from Europe. I said, who's she? And I understood that she was, by the way, she's still around, as a populist leader in Canberra, in the parliament there. She led the movement One Nation, that exactly, now I can say from 2017, that she was using the rhetoric and the language that we are hearing and seeing and listening nowadays from the populists around Europe, and not only around Europe. Even Trump uses the same language, insulting the immigrants, get out Australia, Australia is for Australians, and so on. That sort of rhetoric sounded very much like my Italian rhetoric of, not mine, of course, but by Umberto Bossi, who was going to be one of the allies of Berlusconi later on. And the Northern League in Italy was the first movement in Italy to be what we can say now, using the word now, a populist movement against immigrants, xenophobia, jobs to Italians, and so on. Even a secession. They wanted to cut Italy, the northern Italy, wealthier part of Italy, to cut it from the south, center and southern part of Italy, because they were considered exploiting the tax money, the money of the taxpayers, or the not. So things that you can today hear in the Catalonian case, for instance. So in those days, nobody was really caring about these issues. It was kind of folkloristic movement in Australia, as it was in Italy. So we decided at the university there to do some comparison, not only of the two different systems, completely different systems, but see how politicians spoke. So the language of these politicians, why it was so similar. The language, and then the care of the personality. Again, that has to do with mediatization. That's why the things are very well connected. But eventually we said, well, to write a book on two minoritarian figures like Pauline Hanson and Umberto Bossi around the world, nobody will care. So we enlarged the spectrum. So we included Latin America, the US, the Loughborough movement, France, because the Front National was there since 20 or 30 years. So it was a big thing, not as big as now, but it was already present and influential. And then Austria, it was Haider's. Those were the Haider's days. So he was very popular in Austria. So we noticed that around the world, and also India, by the way, you know, the Hindu party, the BHP, if I am not wrong, the party of the present prime minister, which was very much against the Muslim, of course, very much against those who were not Indians. So, you know, there was a commonality of rhetoric. And we investigated not so much the populism characteristics that was not part of our competences, because we were not political scientists, we were communication scientists. So we studied how the media intervene in all this. And so we made a comparative study looking at the role and impact of the media in the rise and in the development and also in the decline of these movements. And we came up with the four phases, you know, the ground lane phase, when, you know, the media diffuse a climate of opinion, like emphasizing that the rape was made by an immigrant. So, you know, you bombard people year after year, you sort of diffuse a sense of insecurity and also of hostility towards those who are not Australian, who are not Italians. So that ground laying is very much based on the action of the media. And then there was the insurgent, when the movements come up, and the leaders become popular because also they rely on the media. Because if they don't rely on the media, they will continue not to be unknown, they will never become popular. And then there is also the established phase, when some of these movements entered into governing coalitions, even like in Austria, like even in Australia. And we observed that in that case the media became more careful and judging the performance of the populist movement. So they became more critical. If in the previous two phases they were intentionally or unintentionally, most of the time, supporting the populist leaders and movements, eventually they become a bit critical, and so sometimes they thumb down the ways they conduct government or government policies and so on. And then we also observed how the media sometimes accompany a movement to fade out and to disappear because of scandals, like it happened in Sweden a few years ago. You know, there were two leaders who fought each other all the way through, and so they really destroyed their own movement, and the media, you know, pumped into that because it was, you know, funny to see two. So there are many cases that we studied. So we came out with the book in 2003, and then it was ignored for maybe at least 10 years, and all of a sudden our book started to become popular and being bought and read by almost all the students of political communication and those who were interested in populism. And they, of course, they developed. There are groups that have developed, and they came out with beautiful new studies about the role of the media, more sophisticated than ours.
Could I ask a question about the issue of intentionality and whether media institutions intentionally or unintentionally support populism? Because it strikes me that in the countries that I know about, most of the mainstream media, both elite and popular media, are actually very critical of populists. So there was a great deal of criticism of UKIP and Farage in the UK. Front National is heavily criticised by mainstream media in France. Alternative for Deutschland is criticised by most mainstream, or virtually all mainstream media in Germany, in the States. You know, Fox supports Trump, but that's only one network, and you know, so a lot of the mainstream media would actually distance themselves from populist figures, but that doesn't seem to matter very much. You know, populists become popular, you know, irrespective of what the media say.
Yeah, that's one of the hypotheses that we discussed. Even though in the cases that we compare, the 8 cases that are in our book, for instance, the early study that we conducted, we observed that most of the tabloids were unintentionally bringing water to the mills of the movement that would maybe later rise by, as I said before, telling stories that were not necessarily populist, but that had to do with diffused insecurity. Someone later would exploit these stories that didn't have anything to do with pushing for a populist response. Some smart and clever populists, and most of these people are smart and clever and media savvy, by the way, exploited this. See, look at the Chronicle. You know what happens every day in our inner cities or around the country. So why is that? Because our leaders in our capital, in London or in Canberra or in Sydney or in Rome, don't care much about the needs of the population, so the poor people. So that sort of, you know, realization, awareness was triggered by the leaders. It was already there, created unintentionally, because you know the media did their job, especially if they were tabloid. They have to emphasize stories, you know, to be sensational, to exaggerate. And that's, as I said, their job. They make money out of it. So that's the unintentional support that we saw in our cases that the leaders later on would exploit to make their movement successful, electorally speaking. And of course, there are also some intentional cases, like in the Austrian case, the Kronenzeitung, which is the most important tabloid in Austria, was openly supporting. So there was a political bias there. So they were really bringing support to the FPÖ, the populist party of Jörg Haider. So, but those were few cases. We couldn't generalize that all the tabloids and the commercial newspapers that did their job just for profit were working for the populist leaders. Some did. Maybe in the Brexit case, most before Brexit and during the Brexit, maybe not afterwards, but before, looking at the titles, the headlines of the newspapers, you could see how most of the tabloids, British tabloids, were very much in favor of Brexit. In that case, there's an intentional action to bring support to the movement of leave and not to remain. Very few were for remain. Maybe the established newspaper, the mainstream newspapers, they were for remain. Not all of them, but most of them in the British case. So the intentionality or unintentionality depends from case to case, but it's a good way of distinguishing how, at what extent the media can be supportive to any political movement. We are studying populist movements, so we spoke in terms of populism, but it can be applied also to other movements which are not necessarily populist.
One of the things that you've been doing over the last few years is to edit the Encyclopedia of Political Communication, which is that large 3-volume account of what political communication is internationally. So I thought I'd take this opportunity of asking you where you think the big questions lie for future research for political communication scholars. What should we be thinking about?
My easiest answer in this case, because it's a big question, it would take the whole afternoon maybe to respond to your question, would be to suggest the would-be readers of the encyclopedia to read the entry by J. Blomler, Political Communication. He nicely and clearly lists the issues, the critical issues of political communication today. But you can. It depends on the scholarship that you are more familiar with, because the encyclopedia is, by definition, multidisciplinary. So there is psychology, linguistics, philosophy, sociology, political science. So if you are a linguist, probably you would answer to your question, I would answer to your question in a different way. As sociologists observing the phenomenon of politics interacting with the media or with communication and vice versa, I would say that I must say that I'm not being original here, because everybody is doing it now. The new media, the digitalization of society and politics, it's a big, very big challenge and a very big message to scholarly research to investigate more deeply. What are the implications of digitization for politics? As the mass communication created, what we called mediatization, because they were changing, politics was changing vis-a-vis the mass media. Is politics changing, and to what extent, and what are the implications? What are the effects of the encounter of politics and political reality, political action, and political leaders? The encounter with the digital media, which are not only the social media, which are a big part, but also with the digitization is really changing. Has changed already our private life, for instance. So,
do you think it changes populism? Do you think it changes the way that populists
in a way,
communicate?
Of course. Because in the old days, when we studied populism in the early days, the diffusion was made by television, maybe indirectly or unintentionally, and it was quite effective. But now it took some time before gathering crowds around you. Now with social media, we know very well, you can mobilize millions of people potentially, of course, not necessarily on all issues you mobilize millions of people, but that possibility that empowers very much people, and politicians exploit the empowerment of people. Well, it's a completely new landscape, something that has to be discovered and studied, and with much curiosity. So
what do you think about the argument that the sort of new populists or neo-populists are starting to use social media to promote themselves and their movements independently of the mass media or the mainstream media, and
disintermediation.
And this creates a more sort of volatile. Do you support that argument, or do you see it as being? Is it strong or is it flawed, or what are the limits to that?
Well, there isn't much empirical research on that, I must say. So that's one of the
that could be a question.
One of the fields, one of the fields where we should put more energy in discovering how it works. You know, what happens with the media or the social media used by political populist leaders. But we don't know much about. But I think this is my opinion. So it has to be verified by more empirical research. I think that the populist leaders can gain a lot from this, but they also risk a lot because the climates of opinion nowadays change really overnight sometimes. It might happen because of a terrorist attack, for instance, unplanned and unexpected. It might happen because one of the leaders has been shot or killed, or like in the Austrian case, Haider died in a car accident. So his movement almost fell apart, for instance. So these cases can change very quickly the situation. So the new media are a strong instrument for diffusion of your creed, of your message to thousands and millions of people. But at the same time, it can be turned against you by other movements. So there is the possibility by other movements to use the same instrument to contain you or even to destroy you, political and populist leader. So it's you say double-edged.
Double-edged.
Double-edged sort of weapon. But it's a weapon. It's a weapon. It is now commonly used by I must say, even by Angela Merkel. Maybe not herself directly, but her advisors use the social media to support her agenda or to show that she is also smiling.
She doesn't tweet at 3 o'clock in the morning, probably not.
I don't think she does. Maybe she does, but no. We never saw any picture. It would be viral, by the way.
So, Gianpietro, it's been great to talk to you, hear about your insights into contemporary political communication scene, but also to find out more about your intellectual biography. And once again, thank you very much for coming to Loughborough. It's been a pleasure to have you here at the Institute for Advanced Studies.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity and also the honor of being here for the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Loughborough. Thank you.